Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Scottish Aesthetics Forum. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the British Society of Aesthetics for graciously funding the Scottish Aesthetics Forum, and for this talk. And thank you to Dr. Irene Marín Martínez for agreeing to come out to sunny Glasgow and talk to us about.
I mean, Uppsala was not very sunny
either. Normativity of aesthetic coherence. And yeah, we've got a long talk. I'll get out of your way.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for coming and everyone online. I'm really grateful for this Scottish Aesthetics Forum for the invitation, and especially to Pat for organizing everything. So the paper I'm presenting today is part of a three-year project. It's a project funded by the Swedish Research Council, and the title of the project is Aesthetic Rationality, Coherence, and Respect. So what I'm trying to do in this project, what I'm trying to do in this project is to answer two big questions. The first question is, what is aesthetic coherence? And the second question is, why be aesthetically coherent? Why does it matter to be coherent in the aesthetic domain? So what I'm going to try to do today with this paper is to try to give an answer to these two questions. Okay, so the first question is the what question, that what is aesthetic coherence, and the second is the normative question, the why be coherent. So although the project is about coherence and why be coherent, what I'm really interested in the opposite, is in the conflict when we are incoherent, because I think that helps us understand why it matters to try to align our attitudes. So it's true that when we think about potential conflicts in aesthetics, our attention naturally gravitates towards interpersonal disagreements. And there's lots has been written about why we disagree in aesthetics. And we think about disputes between individuals, about whether a painting is beautiful or not, if this novel is well structured. And all those conflicts are very interesting and have dominated much of our attention in aesthetics. But I think that equally significant, but less explored, are the conflicts that occur within a single individual. Okay, and I call that intrapersonal aesthetic disagreements. So such internal conflicts or such tensions can be of two forms. We can have diachronic intrapersonal disagreements, and these are disagreements that occur across time. So for example, imagine a radical change in your aesthetic taste, and you might think there is a disagreement between your previous aesthetic taste or sensibility and your current taste. And this raises questions about, should I revise my previous judgment? Does this mean that my current sensibility is more appropriate than the one I had before? And those are also, I think, interesting questions. And recently there's been some research on these cross-temporal cases. Okay, so I think in the handout, you've got Uku Toming and Olivia Bailey and myself. We've done some work on explaining this cross-temporal case. But what I'm interested in today is in synchronic intrapersonal agreements and disagreements. So these are incoherences that occur at a single point in time. Okay, it's not comparing my current taste to my past self, but what happens now when I engage with her work and I'm actually conflicted in relation to what I experience in relation to this singular work. Okay. So I'm going to distinguish between two forms of synchronic agreement and disagreement, which I call taste consistency and attitudinal coherence. And I'll explain what I mean by these two accounts of coherence in a bit. But as I said, what I'm going to do in this paper is to answer two big questions, which are in a way two sets of questions. The first set of questions is, what is aesthetic coherence? So what does it mean for one's aesthetic response to fit together? And what specific rational requirements might aesthetic coherence impose? The second set of questions are the normative questions, like, is it proper to fault someone for failing to be aesthetically coherent? Can we blame them for not being coherent? And in that case, what are the grounds for faulting them? And to be more precise, which specific norms might they be violating when they are not coherent? Okay. So the paper proceeds as follows. As you see in the handout, I'm going to start in section 2 to examine a form of aesthetic coherence that we might call taste consistency. So we're going to see what it means to be consistent in one's taste. And I'm going to argue that there is no distinctive aesthetic normative basis for this form of coherence. I'm going to think it's interesting that we have a form of coherence that tell us to try to be consistent in our taste, but I think there's no normative aesthetic basis for being consistent. There might be other reasons why we should try to be consistent in our taste, but I think it's not a case of we don't have an aesthetic demand to be consistent in our aesthetic taste. Then in section 3, I'm going to develop another account of aesthetic coherence, which I call attitudinal aesthetic coherence. And this account is going to focus on the relationship among our aesthetic attitudes. And what I'm going to do in section 4 is to try to give a what I call a respect-based account of the normativity of this form of coherence. So I'm going to argue that attitudinal coherence have got aesthetic reasons to try to align our aesthetic response. In section 5, I'm going to address several objections to the account. And in section 6, I'm going to conclude and see where we can go from here. Okay, so moving on to section 2, your handout. And you can also see in the screen, I'm going to just scroll. So we are in point 2, taste consistency. So taste consistency refers to a form of global coherence. It's how an individual's aesthetic responses about different items, for example, different artworks, might agree or disagree with each other. So this notion aims to capture the intuitive idea that the totality of an individual's aesthetic judgments should exhibit some unity. So what I'm going to do now is to examine 2 different accounts of taste consistency. The first one is one given by Cohen, which he centers around the idea of a unified aesthetic personality. And I'm also going to look at Aileen John's recent modification of Cohen's account, focus on what she calls art-focused ethical principles. I'll explain this in a minute. So Cohen, in his paper on consistency in one's personal aesthetics, addresses our first question, the question of what is aesthetic coherence. And he does that by examining how the apparent agreement among our aesthetic responses contributes to the formation of a unified aesthetic personality. So in his view, we search for the thread that connects our aesthetic preferences. And we do this by asking questions such as, what do all my favorite artworks have in common? What does this pattern of preferences reveal about me? Okay, so if you think about the things that you value, it might be like an interesting experiment to think, what does this particular novel that I love has to do with this particular band or with this piece of theatre that I love? Is there any connection between them? Are there any shared aesthetic properties? It has to do something with the ideals that they embody? So Cohen says that this is like an important question that we can ask ourselves. He also thinks that this search for patterns that connect our preferred artworks cause a virtually transcendental need, he says, to understand why one likes the thing one does, but also a desire to find coherence and congruence within one's own aesthetic personality. So searching for this thread is not just that's interesting to see what they think we have in common, but it also might reveal something about ourselves and just also give us a sense of a unified aesthetic personality. So this idea that our aesthetic preferences form a coherent whole that reveals something about who we are has been picked out and developed by several contemporary aestheticians. For example, Nick Riggle illustrates this view through an example, the case of Oliver, and I'm going to just read what he says. I think illustrates Cohen's view. So meet Oliver, an aesthetically normal guy. He likes a bit of this, loves a bit of that, and his aesthetic preferences enjoy a kind of coherence. They suit him. Oliver, we might say, has his own sensibility. Something in him is keyed into certain features of art. It responds powerfully to Proust, Morandi, and Radiohead, somewhat indifferently to Mozart and Monet, and negatively to Celine Dion, and Thomas Kincaid. He does not merely respond strongly to the works he loves. He takes them to be, in some sense, an important part of his life. So on this view, taste consistency serves 2 interrelated functions. The first one is that it fosters aesthetic self-individuation. In a way, it helps us to present ourselves in a way unified but also different to one another. Okay? It also helps to cultivate our personal sense of style. But also, what is more interesting, according to Cohen, it allows to predict one's aesthetic judgments, not just my judgments, but if I have a very close friend or a colleague that I know that likes a set of artworks, I might be able to predict and say, given that you like X, Y, and Z, you might also like this, because in a way there's some shared ideals or properties here that might explain why you might also like this other artwork. So that's the first function. It fosters aesthetic self-individuation. The second one is that it avoids appearing as chaotic or incoherent. It helps to maintain this unified sense of personal identity. Cohen says that we naturally resist experiencing ourselves as merely a concatenation of atomistic aesthetic expression. So I think this is very interesting and illuminating, but I think that Cohen's approach faces significant challenges. And some of these challenges are actually ones that Cohen notes throughout the paper. Though he thinks that although there are problems, we shouldn't worry. We should still strive to have this unified taste. So the first challenge that you have in the handout concerns inconsistent judgments. I'm going to scroll. These are the challenges. The first one has to do with inconsistent judgments. So I think we can all recognize the situation. We often find ourselves in situations where we aesthetically judge an object negatively, despite its apparent similarity to other objects that we judge positively. For example, we can have an individual that judges an object to be aesthetically valuable based on a set of features, and yet that same subject can judge another object as not being aesthetically valuable despite showing the same features. Okay? And we find this also in disagreements with one another. We might judge that a film by our favorite director is great, and then they release a new film, and we don't like it, and our friends are like, well, you should like it, isn't it? And I'm like, no, because even if they share, maybe there's a thematic, they share themes or the subjects that they treat, maybe there's something, even if we can point at a lot of similarity, that still we don't judge them in the same way, even if there are a lot of things that are shared. So Cohen gives an example of it, where he describes his wife's dislike for the furniture produced by the Bombay company, but admires Shaker designed furniture. Apparently they're very similar, I don't know. But his wife only liked one of them. So when Cohen asks how she could like the latter but not the former, given how similar they are, the question that arises, is she obligated to provide an explanation, or could it simply be that she finds one appealing and the other not? Well, according to Cohen, we can push. She needs to give an explanation of why she likes this one and not the other. But this challenge connects with the second one, which concerns the specificity of aesthetic judgment. So Cohen points out that aesthetic evaluation often demands attending to extreme specificity. So if we're talking about shared features, what it means, for example, for a screwball comedy to be witty is not exactly the same as what it means for a romantic comedy from the 2000s to be witty. There might be a shared aesthetic property, wittiness, but the way that it's developed out, how it connects to other properties from the work has nothing to do. So we can't talk about this extrapolation of properties that we just take from one another and try to compare them, okay? So this insistency on specificity creates a tension. It seems that the more we attend to the particularity of each aesthetic object, the more difficult it becomes to identify general principles that could unify our aesthetic personality. The thing is that Cohen suggests that even though complete consistency may be impossible to achieve because we can never find these general principles that explain what connects one thing to another, there still remains, according to him, an aspirational drive to be coherent in our taste. So that's all to kind of explanation of what is aesthetic coherence. So that we've got a story about coherence being a matter of being consistent in one's taste, right? But now, how does Cohen respond to question 2, to the why question? So we've said some things. As I said, for Cohen, there is a human drive for coherence and congruence, and we want to avoid appearing fragmented or arbitrary. But on his view, the endeavor to understand why we favor certain objects over others becomes, he thinks, a deeper project of self-understanding. And this is not just an aesthetic project, this is a more epistemic project or a deeper project. So recently, Irene John has argued in response to Cohen that in general, a sensible goal will be to try to appreciate things as they come, whatever they ask us for, rather than to try and build and manifest a unified aesthetic personality. So we shouldn't try to see how new artworks fit with previous works that we already prefer. We should try to be open to whatever comes and not try to create our aesthetic taste. That's not what aesthetics is about. We need to be like open to what might come. So these concerns suggest that while taste consistency may be psychologically important for self-understanding or helpful to try to understand oneself and others, it's not clear that it constitutes a distinctively aesthetic norm that should guide our aesthetic lives. So let's move on to Irene John's recent alternative approach, which is a modification of Cohen's taste consistency. Irene John has argued that we should shift focus from an individual's aesthetic preferences to the agreement among one's art-focused ethical principles. So John suggests that consistency should be sought at the level of one's general commitments about the value and function of art. So we shouldn't be looking for coherence in how our preferred artworks relate to each other, but on the principles about what good art should be about or what's the function of art held by an individual. Okay? That's where consistency where should we be looking at. So this art-focused ethical principles emphasize broad claims about art's value and not preferences for particular works. Okay? So examples of these principles will be things like art should highlight uncomfortable truths, or good art promotes empathy and understanding. In a way, these are principles that guides one's evaluation. On this view, taste inconsistency arises when, for instance, one praises a cliched and superficial artwork while simultaneously upholding the principle that art should highlight uncomfortable truths. So we find an inconsistency there between the principle that, in a way, is supposed to guide the individual's evaluation of art and this particular evaluation made in relation to an artwork. Okay? So there is a tension between the general principle and this more concrete aesthetic judgment. So there we find an incoherence according to John. So in her words, what we find is an inconsistency of belief when someone prioritizes opposing or deeply conflicting goals for art as a whole. So she says that there is pressure from the demand on a person to make sense to themselves about what they hold to be good with respect to art. She also acknowledges that Cohen's concern for self-understanding is compelling at this level of principal reflection about art's proper function. Okay, so she also acknowledges that it's a question of understanding oneself, but it's just that we shouldn't be looking at how our preferred artworks relate to each other and searching for general principles, but we should be looking at the relation between our general principles or beliefs about art, about what art should aim at, and our more individual judgments of specific artworks. So I think that move it's helpful not to look at just our preferences and to look more at our attitudes. But I think John's approach, as she frames it faces its own challenges. Okay? So the two main challenges. The first one is the difficulty of connecting general principles to a specific aesthetic object. So it's often unclear how to translate these broad principles, or at least the way that she spells them out, into judgments about individual works. For example, how does a general value like good art should denounce injustices apply to an abstract work or to a landscape painting? So we see that something else needs to be said here, or maybe this is not the right way to go. The second worry is that John's framework seems to have a very narrow scope. It only applies to artistic objects. It's just like principles about art. Does it mean that we can be incoherent in other domains? Maybe in our aesthetic experiences about literature, design, food, or other domains where aesthetic judgments are common, but where these art ethical principles she identifies might not be relevant, or we might not have them? Or does it mean that we need design ethical principles, food ethical principles? That could be a way to go. But most significantly, I think that the kind of consistency that John advocates appears to be simply a matter of belief consistency, which is true of all kinds of beliefs. So there's nothing specific about the aesthetic domain, I think, in this answer to the normative question. There doesn't seem to be a distinctively aesthetic normative demand at work here, just the general requirement that one's beliefs should not contradict one another. Which, I mean, fair enough. I don't think that John is trying to give an aesthetic normative answer. It's just that for this project, I think that this wouldn't be specific to aesthetics. So just to summarize what we've done here, so both Cohen and John offer, I think, important insights into the nature of taste consistency as a way of understanding what it means to be coherent in aesthetics. But as we've seen, neither account provides a compelling explanation for why we should value this form of coherence. If we think about an aesthetic coherence, if there's something like that. The first state consistency does not appear to be properly connected to aesthetic value. It's a project of understanding, or just about, as we said, belief consistency is not a specific demand, but a general requirement of rational belief. So we don't have like weighty aesthetic reasons to maintain a unified aesthetic personality. This analysis suggests that if aesthetic coherence is to be normatively significant, we need to look elsewhere. And what I'm going to try to do in the next section is to offer a different form of intrapersonal aesthetic agreement, what I call attitudinal aesthetic coherence, which I will argue, or try to argue, that has a more direct connection to aesthetic value. Okay. So moving on to the next section. Okay. So in contrast to taste consistency, which as we have seen concerns our judgments of different aesthetic objects and how they form a coherent pattern, attitudinal aesthetic coherence operates at a more local level, involving our engagement with individual objects. So this second form focuses on the relationship between two distinct aesthetic attitudes directed at the same object. So this is about the relation between our aesthetic judgments and our aesthetic likings. So how our judgments relate, are connected or disconnected from our likings. Okay. So just so we are on the same page, I'm going to understand aesthetic judgments as those value ascribing verdicts by which we autonomously, that is, without relying on others, determine the presence or absence of aesthetic merit in an object. So when we say things like X is aesthetically worthy, X is aesthetically good, or X is beautiful, if we use beautiful in this more honorific term, these are first-hand judgments that constitute evaluative claims about an object's aesthetic value. And what is important is that they are distinct from merely descriptive claims about an object's aesthetic properties. So when we say things like X is elegant, or X is banal, or X is somber, those are not the kinds of judgments I'm interested in. So this, I'm interested in like more purely evaluative ones. And then what do I mean by aesthetic liking? So aesthetic liking refers to a distinctive affective attitude that involves a positive orientation towards an object, or a negative orientation if we talk about dislikes, okay? So what's important is that this affective response is meant to be disinterested, okay? So it's true that we like certain bands, novels, because we may be attached to them because they remind us of someone or they remind us of our past selves. Those are not the kinds of likings that I'm talking about here. Okay, it's not like a personal interested liking. They're meant to say something about how objects matter aesthetically to the subject. It's connected to our sensibility, but to our aesthetic sensibility. Okay. Okay. So just there. So let's see. What I'm doing here is offering a different account of what it means to be coherent that focuses on the relation between these two attitudes, our judgments and our life. Now, this form of coherence falls under the domain of structural rationality. If we follow authors like Daniel Fogel or Alex Wordsnip, who distinguish between two dimensions of rationality, we have substantive rationality, which involves responding correctly to reasons. We can say that an agent is substantially rational if their aesthetic responses are justified by the evidence or reasons available to them. But we also have another sense of what it means to be rational, which is to be structurally rational. So to be structurally rational is about having the right relations hold between one's mental states independently from the reasons for having those states. Okay. But to be more precise, structural rationality is connected with a set of distinctive principles or rational requirements that prohibit certain combinations of attitudes. So, for example, we have requirements that prohibit cyclical preferences, that prohibit means-end coherence, or that prohibit various forms of acrasia, or that prohibit belief in consistency. So we've got different kinds of requirements, both in the practical and the theoretical domain. And according to philosophers that make this distinction between structural rationality and substantive rationality, one is incoherent and thus irrational if they violate one of those requirements. Okay, it's just a small. Now, given this distinction, attitudinal aesthetic coherence concerns structural rationality rather than substantive rationality. So when we say that an agent is aesthetically incoherent, we might be saying that they are irrational in this structural sense. Okay? So, as I said, we have a list of requirements in the practical and theoretical domain, but do we have any requirements in the aesthetic domain in relation to or how these two attitudes, our judgments and our likings, are to be combined? Well, I've done some work trying to argue that we have a rational requirement that can be formulated as an aesthetic encratic principle. And according to this requirement, one is rationally required to aesthetically like what one judges to be aesthetically valuable. You have it formalized in the handout, and what is important is that this is a wide scope requirement, and the use of square brackets denotes that the normative operator, the rationally required, takes wide scope over the whole set of attitudes. So this means that the requirement can be satisfied either by liking what one judges to be valuable, or by revising one's judgment that something is valuable. So, make it more simple, an agent violates this principle, this requirement, and thus exhibits aesthetic incoherence if they hold incompatible attitudes such as a positive aesthetic judgment and an aesthetic dislike for the same object, or a negative aesthetic judgment plus an aesthetic dislike for that same object. Okay, so those are the combinations of attitudes that are prohibited. Okay? So with examples, for example, the first form of incoherence occurs when someone judges a work of art to be aesthetically valuable, but feels a dislike towards that same work. For example, you can judge positively and acknowledge that jazz improvisation demonstrates remarkable aesthetic achievement, while avoiding, whenever you can, jazz concerts because you don't like it. Okay? And you feel this tension. What's important is that you need to feel this tension. Okay. But we also have it in case of guilty pleasures, which is like the opposite, where one enjoys works that the individual knows that have no aesthetic worth. Okay? And there's also that tension, like enjoying or liking something that is judged to be bad, aesthetically bad. Okay, so this is just another story that we can tell about what it means to be aesthetically coherent or incoherent. That is not related with how our preferences relate to each other, but it's related to how our attitudes in relation to a single object relate to each other. What about the why question? Why be attitudinally coherent in the aesthetic domain? So why should one feel compelled to try and align the judgments, their aesthetic judgments, and their aesthetic likings? Is it really problematic to judge something like Love Island to be aesthetically bad and yet enjoy watching it, or some other show? And is it concerning when someone consistently chooses to spend time with works they judge to be aesthetically inferior rather than engaging with objects they acknowledge to possess superior aesthetic value? I should also mention that the Socratic principle involves degrees. Okay, so if you're having a hard day and you want to just to watch like a silly show, I don't think you're really being irrational in that sense. It has to do also with how many times you violate the principle, and also it has to do with the balance of the attitude. So if your judgment is really, really positive, and you can really spell out all how marvelous something is, but you really, really, really dislike it, I think there's more tension that, for example, acknowledging that, yeah, I know this show is quite bad, but the liking that you experience with it is not like the best thing ever. It's not like, so it really depends on how we understand this attitude, okay? But really the question becomes whether this aesthetic incoherences require correction or whether they simply reflect the complex nature of our aesthetic lives. So it's true that the aesthetic realm is often conceived as a domain of exploration and freedom, where coherence in one's responses seems less important than to say in the theoretical or practical domain. So for example, if you believe that you should treat a friend in a good way, or that you should treat others rightly, but you act in the opposite way and you mistreat them, you might feel that that case of incoherence is more problematic maybe than in the aesthetic case, or in the epistemic domain. If you just believe things that you have no evidence for, you might think that it's also more problematic than the kind of incoherence that we find here. I think that's one line of thought that someone might have. But now, is it really true that there are no harmful costs when these two aesthetic attitudes diverge, when our judgments and our likings diverge? Imagine the following scenario. What if members of an aesthetic community adopted certain cultural objects or aesthetic practices as part of their identity, as part of their culture, while simultaneously considering them to be aesthetically unworthy? Or what if they dismiss objects that they believe to possess aesthetic value? Wouldn't we think there is something problematic about the appreciated norms governing such community? So what I want to do next is I'm going to attempt to answer the question of why we should be aesthetically coherent. Just try here to put some pressure on giving you trying to convince you that there might be a reason why we should strive to be coherent. But why? Why should aesthetic agents strive for this kind of coherence? So moving on to section 4, I'm going to start sketching what I call a respect-based account of attitudinal coherence. So I'm going to propose that the normativity of attitudinal aesthetic coherence can be understood through the lens of aesthetic respect. So we can understand aesthetic respect as an imperfect duty to respect aesthetic value, but also to respect oneself as an aesthetic agent. This approach illuminates why failing to align our judgments and likings constitutes a significant normative failure, one that concerns both our relationship to objects of aesthetic value, but also our standing as aesthetic agents. So respect is a complex notion with lots of applications across different domains. And without attempting a comprehensive account of respect's nature, I suggest that aesthetic respect specifically involves two interconnected dimensions. So it involves respect for objects of aesthetic value, and this means recognizing and responding appropriately to the aesthetic value of objects, experiences, and practices. And see that I spell it as respect for objects of aesthetic value, but not for concrete or particular artworks or objects. It's just respect for objects of aesthetic value. The second dimension, I believe that aesthetic respect involves a respect for oneself as an aesthetic agent. So by respecting objects of aesthetic value, we are also maintaining the integrity of our aesthetic agency through coherent and reflective aesthetic engagement. So if one is familiar with Stephen Darwell's famous distinction of two kinds of respect, we might ask whether aesthetic respect involves both appraisal respect and recognition respect. So appraisal respect is esteem for excellence or achievement, which involves a positive evaluation of merit. And recognition respect is about acknowledging the dignity and inherent worth of something or someone, where the appropriate response is to give proper weight to it into one's deliberation. So the self-directed aspect of aesthetic respect resembles recognition respect. We recognize our own status as aesthetic agents capable of responding appropriately to value, whilst the object-directed aspect more closely resembles appraisal respect that has to do with responding positively to objects in virtue of aesthetic excellence. So why respect? There might be other attitudes involved. We might think that it's all about love, or it's all about admiration, or it's all about pleasure. But I think there are good reasons, or compelling reasons, to try to incorporate respect in our understanding of aesthetic normativity. So drawing on work by Kurt Stilburn, he's got a recent paper connecting coherence to duties of respect. He also thinks that, but he's thinking that the epistemic domain, that we can recognize that values generally demand respect. And this kind of respect involves recognizing the intrinsic worth and complexity of something beyond its utility or pleasure-generating potential. And it's true that his focus is on respect for truth. But I think that this framework can be extended to aesthetic value. And respect for aesthetic value, or respect for beauty, if you want to choose beauty as the way of cashing out aesthetic value. So for example, what does it mean to exercise this aesthetic respect? Well, it means that we're gonna respect the understanding and cultural significance of an object, also its historical context or its intrinsic meaning, and not just whether it provides aesthetic pleasure. Okay? So this commitment to respect aesthetic value operates, I think, at a deep level of our normative psychology. It's not merely a consciously held principle like the ones that Aileen and John was talking about, but rather an implicit norm that governs and structures our aesthetic engagement. So Sylvain observes that intentionally doing what appears to violate your duty to X is a way to manifest this respect for X. In the aesthetic domain, this suggests that when we judge something to possess aesthetic value, but fail to favor it, we act in a way that appears to violate our duty to that value, thereby manifesting disrespect. So how can we demonstrate this commitment to aesthetic respect? Well, I think it's through adherence to the aesthetic encratic principle that we can manifest this respect. So it's when we align one's aesthetic judgments with our likings that we manifest aesthetic respect. So what does it mean to be incoherent and thus to disrespect aesthetic value? Well, it's when we fail to align our judgments, and there are two key forms of disrespect that result from this misalignment. So we might disrespect aesthetic value when we judge something to possess aesthetic value, or fail to respond to it with appropriate likings. But we also disrespect, in a way, exert a disrespect towards oneself Incoherent attitudes, we can say, reflect failure of aesthetic self-governance, in a way we are undermining our ability to act as aesthetic behavior. So this dual respect isn't merely a formal failure, but a substantive failing in our relationship to value and to ourselves. So, for example, when I persistently, enjoy what I judge to be aesthetically worthless, or fail to appreciate what I judge to be aesthetically excellent, I demonstrate a fractured relationship to aesthetic value that compromises my standing as an aesthetic agent. So it's important to note that this respect-based account that I'm introducing today doesn't imply that we must always come to like what we judge to be aesthetically valuable. As I said, syncretic principle is a wide scope requirement. That means that it can be satisfied either by bringing our likings into alignment with our judgments or by revising our judgments in light of our affective responses. So it might be that when we have a conflict between our likings and our judgments, it doesn't mean that we have to force ourselves to like what we judge to be aesthetically valuable. It might be that this gives us a reason to revise the judgment. It might be that we were mistaken and we have reason to revise our judgment to make it align with our dislike. Okay? So there are two ways of satisfying the requirement. So as I said, or I mentioned briefly, aesthetic respect can be understood as having a form similar to an imperfect duty. So briefly put, imperfect duties have three features that are relevant to aesthetic coherence. So first, imperfect duties require an adoption of general maxims to promote certain ends, rather than prescribing specific actions. So in our context, this means adopting aesthetic respect as a way of structuring our aesthetic engagements or our aesthetic lives. It's not about following specific principles about which specific artworks need to be appreciated. Okay, there are many ways that one could satisfy or so that one could exert aesthetic respect. It doesn't mean that one has to respect every aesthetic object that is aesthetically valuable. Okay, so it's not that over demanding. Second, imperfect duties allow for flexibility. As Lisa Bastian has recently suggested, agents may choose not to be coherent on a given occasion, provided they are committed to being coherent on other occasions. So as I mentioned, this can allow us to accommodate cases of guilty pleasures or moments where we are aware that there's a tension involved, but if we are like committed to being coherent in our aesthetic engagements, and we just recognize that in this specific moment we can't really satisfy the requirement, that is fine. Okay. So despite allowing latitude, imperfect duties, as Lisa Bastian mentioned, they are full-blown duties. Okay. So this explains why persistent aesthetic incoherence remains criticizable, because it reflects a failure to adopt coherence as a genuine end. So before concluding, I want to address several aspects of the respect-based account that I've introduced today to clarify its scope and its implications. I also want to acknowledge some potential worries that I think merit further investigation. Okay, so we are in next section, objections. So the first worry or problem is a problem of apparent respect. So the proposed account of aesthetic respect faces a critical challenge, and it's the following. It allows an agent to manifest aesthetic respect while potentially holding incorrect aesthetic judgment. So consider the case of Francis Ford Coppola's latest film, Megalopolis, which I don't know if you've seen it, but I don't recommend it. Yeah. So Megalopolis, which received this year Razzie Awards for Worst Director and nominations for Worst Screenplay and Film. So Razzie Awards are like the anti-Oscars, like the awards for the worst films of the year. But imagine the following case. Imagine an individual who claims, Megalopolis is an excellent film and I love it. So here we have a case that demonstrates what we might call respect, aesthetic respect, because we find an alignment between the aesthetic judgment of this individual and their aesthetic liking. Okay, but we might call it apparent respect. So compare these two cases. We have apparent respect, where one may hold an incorrect judgment and manifest respect through the alignment of the aesthetic attitudes. And we will say that it manifests respect because the person demonstrates a proper orientation towards what they take to be aesthetically right. But we have to, in a way, distinguish this from cases of failure of respect. Imagine now the following case. Casablanca is an excellent film. I think we can all agree on that one. Casablanca is an excellent film, but I don't like it. So one may hold a correct aesthetic judgment, but fail to manifest aesthetic respect through the misalignment of their aesthetic attitudes. So in this case, we got a correct aesthetic judgment, a positive aesthetic, and also a positive aesthetic judgment, which is connected to a dislike. Okay? So in this case, the person does not demonstrate proper orientation towards what they take to be aesthetically valuable. So even if the agent is holding a correct judgment, they're not manifesting aesthetic respect. So the key insight is that the normativity of aesthetic coherence is not primarily about holding correct judgments. So you can respect or we have this apparent respect towards things that in a way do not merit our respect. So even when one's aesthetic judgments are mistaken, the sincere attempt to properly relate with what one takes to be aesthetically valuable generates, in a way, a real reason, in a way, to respect it. So the individual who enthusiastically, although mistakenly, appreciates Megalopolis is not failing to respect aesthetic value, but it's because it's complying with a genuine aesthetic commitment. Okay? I just want to make that distinction in case there were worries. The second worry is the universal applicability objection. So the respect-based account appears to presuppose that all objects of aesthetic value deserve respect. And we might think this is too demanding. We cannot really respect all objects of aesthetic value. So while that, and this might create, I think, a misleading analogy with moral respect. So while there are compelling grounds to think that all persons deserve respect, regardless of their qualities or actions, it's much less obvious to say that all aesthetic objects warrant a similar form of respect. So for example, recent work on aesthetic obligations suggests that aesthetic commitments are typically personal and particular, and they arise from an individual's meaningful relationship with specific aesthetic objects. Okay, so people like Anthony Cross or Robbie Kubala, they have argued that if I have a special relationship with an object, maybe with a music band that I really like, I might have an obligation to continuously engage with it. And maybe in cases where there is, there might be a reason to abandon that band. People like Google, I think that there is a real tension because it seems that we have like this commitment to objects that we love. But what is important is that this commitment is personal. It's based on this meaningful relationship that I have with the object. It's nothing about the object in itself, but it's about this personal relationship. And what's more importantly, other people are not obligated to have this same relation. Okay? But does this mean that aesthetic respect should be the same? That we should only strive to respect those objects that we have special relation to? Is it too demanding to say that we have to respect all objects of aesthetic value? So I think that this objection misconstrues the nature of respect in my account. So I'm not claiming that all aesthetic objects deserve respect in the same way that, for example, persons do. Okay? Rather, I argue that we have a duty to properly relate to value, okay, in a more abstract or general sense. Okay? So it's this commitment to respect aesthetic value, not to respect specific works, that generates a normative pressure on me, not because the objects have intrinsic rights or dignity, but because our own commitment generates a reason to value them. So the respect at issue is not directed primarily at the object themselves, but at the aesthetic value that they embody, and at their own capacity to recognize and respond to this value. So I should mention that there are many ways of manifesting aesthetic respect. It's not just about engaging with artworks, but one can manifest aesthetic respect by creating artworks, by preserving objects or cultural artifacts, by recommending or promoting aesthetic objects. So there are many ways that one can manifest aesthetic respect. Okay, and the last worry is the over-intellectualization objection. So some might argue that aesthetic experience often involves tension, ambivalence, or even contradiction between attitudes. For some philosophers, we value the very fact that our responses aren't fully integrated. Moreover, artworks are intricate artifacts that elicit a variety of mixed responses, making it unclear which attitudes we should try to make cohere. Additionally, certain artworks pose systemic and moral challenges, leading some to think that the value lies precisely in the exploration or even the confusion and mental disharmony that they evoke. So I'm not advocating for the elimination of productive tensions in aesthetic experience, nor am I requiring immediate harmony between every aesthetic response. Okay? Note that I'm only talking about the relation between judgment and likings. Okay? We might think that there might be more confusion or disharmony between different emotional responses in relation to a work, but here I'm just focusing on these two attitudes. Okay? You might feel like have mixed feelings of pleasure and displeasure in relation to something. I'm not talking about those mixed responses, okay? But rather the respect-based account acknowledges that both aesthetic judgment and liking are themselves reflective attitudes that can incorporate complexity, ambivalence, and development over time. As I said, the Socratic principle can be satisfied either by developing appropriate orientation for what we judge valuable or by revising our judgment. So in these moments of mental confusion or disharmony, I take them to be an invitation precisely to see if we need a revision in the judgments on our likings, okay? And I also acknowledge that this revision, it's difficult because sometimes it requires abandoning a positive evaluation that we made of something, or revising our sensibility to like something that we dislike. So these are like challenging issues. I'm not saying that. So I'm acknowledging that it will take time in some cases to try to align our judgments. In some cases, we might never succeed. But it's just like this striving to try to make them aligned, which I think is valuable. Okay, but just saying that this and aesthetics things are messy and we should just leave them as they are. No, I think that we should explain why there is the tension in the first place. Why do we feel conflicted? So as I said, I think there's room for this exploratory and challenging aspect of aesthetic engagement while still maintaining that persistent, unreflected divergence between judgment and liking manifests a problematic form of disrespect towards aesthetic value and oneself. So I'm just gonna summarize what I've done today. So the paper has examined two forms of intrapersonal aesthetic agreement or disagreement that call taste consistency and attitudinal coherence, but I've also explored the normative significance of these forms of coherence. I have argued that while taste consistency lacks compelling aesthetic normative force, attitudinal aesthetic coherence is normatively significant because it's grounded in aesthetic respect. I think there's several promising avenues for future research that might emerge from this respect-based account. First, we might explore the relationship between aesthetic respect and adjacent normative concepts such as aesthetic integrity or aesthetic authenticity and sincerity. And a key question concerns how aesthetic respect relates to other forms of respect. Okay? To moral or epistemic, I said a little bit, but there's more to say of how different aesthetic respect is to other forms of respect. And second, further investigation, I think, is needed regarding how the respect-based account applies to cases where aesthetic judgments conflict with other values, okay, such as moral or practical considerations. There might be reasons not to revise your likings or your dislike for non-aesthetic reasons, but as I said, I'm still interested in aesthetic likings, but still there's a conversation to have of how strong our aesthetic likings is, or they are really independent from our moral sensibility, for example. So by understanding attitudinal coherence in terms of respect, I think we gain insight into why aesthetic coherence matters, not merely as a formal constraint on our mental states, but as an integral aspect of our relationship to aesthetic value. So in the end, what makes aesthetic coherence normatively significant is the way in which coherence allows us to properly appreciate both the aesthetic value of objects and our own capacity as agents who can recognize and respond appropriately to that value. Thank you.